All right, we'll continue to work through these questions then. Okay, so a couple more comments. Samuki, taken both sides are representing truth. The conclusion as to the source of these truths seems to be the main question that remains forever unanswered. Can you see the comments on your side?
I can see it, yeah. Taken both sides are representing truths. The conclusion as to the source of these truths seems to be the main question that remains forever unanswered. I think, that the fact that I can take Vedic metaphysics, which is at least thousands of years old, and then apply that to the current scientific understanding and find quantum mechanics like validating it is an indication that the source of the Vedic truth is, well, Krishna says this in Bhagavad Gita, right? He says those who say that the path of karma yoga and Sankhya yoga or philosophical inquiry are different is incorrect. That one who applies themselves equally well to one of them achieves the result of both. So either through that ascending process of like experimentation, observation, you can go that way and look. And if you're actually open, if you don't start with like everything's purely material, God doesn't exist, we're only material. If you don't start with that, you won't end up with that as the conclusion. Like you will eventually find at some point in that inquiry that there is some non-material, non-physical aspect to reality. And at that point, you're like, okay, is there some way for me to access that? And you can continue on that way. Otherwise, you can accept knowledge in the descending process through Vedic tradition, and then suddenly you have access to all these other things. Like, we validated it up to the point of Bhagavad Gita where it talks about the, superior to the sense objects of the senses, superior to the senses is the mind, superior to the mind is the intelligence, the false ego, and the self, superior to all of those. And, Bhagavad Gita talks also about the supreme source of everything. And so that knowledge is all there as well. And maybe that knowledge is not as empirically testable as, say, things about the material world are. But the fact that the material knowledge that's in there is superior to, what people have arrived at purely through just material observation is an indicator that the other knowledge that's in there is also of a superior nature. And it gives the mechanism by which you can test it. So, you can know that Krishna is the source of everything by chanting the Hare Krishna Mahamantra, for example, as a process of self-realization. Or you can go to Kalachanji's and just eat there. That's another way to do it.
All right. Krishna Das. The conclusion of both is mind is material. Aron's arguments point out that the mind experience is the result of the brain functions. The Vedic points out that the body is a result of the subtle.
The mind experience is the result of the brain functions. Well, we didn't really resolve that, right? That is the idea of qualia, like in a purely material. Yeah, no, I would have to agree with that. I think that qualia and like self-exist, that the self-awareness at that level is introspect. It's the function of introspection of the neural network. So mind experience is the result of brain functions. If there's a self-experiencing, well, the Gita says and the Bhagavatam say that the super soul is present within everything as well as the soul. So the soul and the super soul are the same thing.
Bhagavad Gita calls the experiencer Kshetragya, the knower of the field, and that's basically amounts to what the word soul is often used to refer to, and that's clearly a non-material element.
Well, yeah, it distinguishes between the Kshetra and the Kshetragya, the field and the knower of the field. But the thing is that the experience, mind experience itself is also material. It's something that is experienced. So it belongs to Kshetra rather than Kshetragya.
You and me can have a debate on is the mind material now. Yeah, well, you get like near-death experiences where people have veridical experiences, which means experiences which are verifiable. Like one person was out of their body and noticed there was a shoe in the gutter on the roof of the hospital building, and there was actually a shoe. And some people have seen what the doctor was doing. Like one person saw the doctor flapping his arms like wings. And when he came back from the surgery, he was like, "Why were you flapping your arms like that?" And the doctor was embarrassed and explained that he was trying to keep his hands sterile. So he was keeping them up to his chest. And he was waving his arms around to point for the nurses to tell them where to cut and so on.
Okay, so
that suggests that qualia is not necessarily caused by the brain, although the brain is definitely involved in it, because when the brain is impaired, then our senses are impaired. But, you can put a lampshade over a light and that impairs the light coming out of the lamp.
So the thing about that is that, okay, first of all, you have to control for whether that's actually... See, in science, you have to have reproducible experiments, and those are not reproducible. That's one thing.
It's still data.
It's data, sure, but that doesn't address my point that it's not a reproducible experiment. Like, you need to have a reproducible experiment in order for it to be science. So that's the first problem that you're going to have with that. And then the second thing is that, again, it's going to destroy the total explanatory power of our current body of knowledge. Like, you're introducing more hidden variables than you're explaining.
That's a cause for cognitive dissonance, not a valid epistemological framework for rejecting something.
Yeah, well, it can open up fruitful like avenues for further investigation, right? But it's only at the point where you can provide something that has superior explanatory power, superior predictive power, and then as a result of that, some kind of technology that you can build that you can't build without it. I mean, the ultimate validation of the periodic table as an explanation for the elements, because, prior to like electron microscopes, you couldn't validate that's what the atoms look like, and that's, it was theoretical, but you could use it to make materials and, chemical combinations that you couldn't do otherwise, which demonstrates its superior power in developing a technology. But based on what you're saying there, you're unable to produce any kind of technology that demonstrates it's a superior physical understanding. That's the key problem.
No,
with
there's the technology doesn't fix your teeth or fly you in a jet plane, but it does fix the existential hole in the heart. So psychologists widely acknowledge that religious belief and religious community is beneficial for having a healthy mind and so on. So that's the kind of technology you get from it. That's so what you're saying is, having a practical application for the theory is required for it to be useful. So, some practical applications put rockets in the sky and make it so that we can use Skype and live stream, and other practical applications make it so you feel satisfied in your heart.
Yeah, but the thing about that is that doesn't make a statement about any specific belief. So you could believe in the flying spaghetti monster, if you like, not ironically, but so, is there any scientific evidence that shows that believing that specific thing does that?
The discussion today is kind of an attack on physicalism. So if any of those theories are at all true, and, something can be remotely true and still be useful, like quantum physics, Newtonian physics is fairly accurate, but it's not 100% true. So, you can predict the movements of several planets using Newtonian physics and do lots of things. It's only when you want to get precise that you need to bring in quantum physics. And so these beliefs being beneficial, it's not a contradiction that a wide variety of beliefs offer similar benefits, similar to how, in science you can have a theory that's mostly right and it's still beneficial. But what they all have in common is a rejection of physicalism. Like physicalism or naturalism, it kind of tends towards nihilism, because it's like there's no meaning in life. There's nothing, its only meaning is what we imagine, which is not as satisfying as thinking that the meaning is actually objectively outside of ourselves.
You know what I think is a key distinction in Vedic knowledge that makes it, like, Vedic culture distinct and I would say superior to many others, is it really is like it's a synthetic approach to knowledge and culture. Like, Vedic knowledge is all about yes and. So you'll find every level of understanding, like, the pure atomic theory of Vaisheshika is in like the third canto of the Bhagavatam, calculation of time from the atom. You'll find that in there. You'll find like a description of the universal form in the second canto. And then a description, elsewhere that says that that's for like the less intelligent, and then, people understand it in this way. And rather than refuting pretty much anything, they always assimilate it into the knowledge base and the understanding. And it's yes and. So I think all of modern material science is like assimilable in that way. And I see the breakdown at that quantum mechanics level.
All right, I've changed the layout now, so it's a bit more clear.
Okay. Any more questions from the?
Yeah.
comment
Sorry,
stream?
I've got to pull the next one up. Probably talk about that one for a while. Where did I get up to? I think we did the conclusion. Yeah. So this one. Oops. Okay, can you see that now?
Yeah. Body, mind, intelligence, ahankara, false ego. Yeah. I can see the verse in my head, but I can't remember the Sanskrit right now. If I saw the beginning of it, what's that verse that talks about the eight separated?
I don't know the verse,
Prakriti?
but there's there's the 5 senses of action, the 5 knowledge acquiring senses, and the 5 action senses above, and then there's the mind, which oversees all of those. And then there's can't remember all of them. I think false ego, mind, false ego, and intelligence.
So you're talking about
intelligence is the
Sankhya.
nearest to the soul.
Yeah, the directions, the 5 knowledge acquiring 5 active senses, the directions, those things, but also the 8 separated energies that Krishna talks about in Bhagavad Gita, where he says earth, air, fire, water, ether, mind, intelligence, and false ego. And then above all of these is the soul. So mind, intelligence, and ahankara. Well, mind is the repository of the sense perception and also memory, and then intelligence is like the discriminatory function of like choosing, like this is favorable, this is not favorable, accepting and rejecting courses of action. That's the function of intelligence, which is both mind and intelligence are functions of the neural network of the brain, we would say from a Western perspective, which is what I pointed to when I distinguished mind at the beginning. And then ahankara, or false ego, it means ahamkara. So aham means I, and kara means making. So ahamkara literally means the I-forming energy. And there's a couple of ways that's kind of manifested and can be distinguished. From an Ayurvedic perspective, I find this very interesting, is like that the living entity is some collection of material elements which is bound together by some, like a force field, and a human being is basically a hollow tube which has an outer surface which has got the skin on it, and then an inner surface which runs from your mouth through your gut all the way to your anus. So you are basically a hollow tube. And then what happens is you eat food, it goes in your mouth, it goes down into your digestive system, and then gets assimilated into the body by this ahankara, or the I-forming energy, which pulls those material elements across the boundary and then like forces them into the service of the I-forming energy, and they become like fuel and building material for the cells. So that's one level that it's manifested at, and that's described in the Ayurveda of the Charaka Samhita. And more fundamentally, at a metaphysical level, the I-forming energy, the ahankara, is the energy which makes the soul associate itself with the experience, the senses and the mind of one particular body within the material universe.
So Krishnadas commented later, I was just trying to see if you guys could establish the difference between the subtle material and gross material. According to the Vedic consensus, the mind goes on after the body perishes.
Yeah, that's in the Bhagavad Gita. It says, thus the living entity carries his conceptions of life from one body to the next, just as the air carries aromas. I don't know if that's necessarily like when I go to reconcile like Western material science with the Bhagavad Gita, that as a function of the mind, it would need to be the function of some further, more subtle energy, which at the moment we have not distinguished from a Western material science perspective.
I don't think they will distinguish it, to be honest. Yeah, I mean, also keep in mind that the term material as used when translating it from the Sanskrit is different from the way Western philosophy generally uses it. So in Western philosophy, when we say material or physical, we mean composed of matter, like you have quarks and photons and then atoms and then chemicals and molecules and eventually you get proteins and cell structures. That's what they mean by material in Western philosophy. But when from the Vaishnava standpoint, when we say material, we mean separate from Krishna. So the subtle material is still part of this reality which goes on where there's the illusion of being separate from Krishna.
Yeah, well, there's two different ways of defining material, right? One is like separate from Krishna, and then the other is like inferior energy. I mean, nothing is separate from Krishna ultimately.
Yeah.
And yet there is still the inferior energy and the superior energy.
But really that Vedic point of view, even when it says material, it's still rejecting physicalism. Well, because it's saying there's another layer of reality, but because it's also saying that the physical energy is actually just Krishna's energy. And it's, it's a conscious phenomenon like Drupta Karma Prabhu, also known as Michael Cramo, describes that the Vedic perspective is that this material world is a simulation designed to give conscious observers sensory experiences.
The virtual reality hypothesis. I love it.
That's basically what you find in the Vaishnava Siddhanta, which is fully supported by the quantum argument, which you gave, where we see that basically until an observer looks at matter, it exists as a probability wave. And this is exactly what we find in simulations. If you play a video game, there's a probability engine. And until in the game you actually look at part of the screen or move to a certain part of the action, what's seen on the screen and how the physics play out exists as probability, and then when it actually renders on the screen, then it fixes in a particular outcome. And we find the same thing in quantum physics, where it just exists as a probability wave until a conscious observer looks at it.
Yeah, it exists as a potentiality or multiple potentialities. And then the Everett interpretation of that is the many worlds interpretation, which is that the wave function actually collapses into all of the possibilities. But you, as the living entity, find yourself in one of those. But there is like all of them are actually collapsed. And that's how quantum computers are able to make calculations that involve more atoms than there are in the classical universe, because the number of parallel universes is infinite, whereas the number of atoms within each of those universes is finite.
All right, I'll pull up another comment. Some of these people might have been hoping to get Aron Ra commenting on them, but anyway.
Yeah.
We're the next best thing, right? It's cutting off. Hang on. Okay. Samuki again. How do observations in science necessarily establish there is no God? Very interesting to listen to. Both speakers admirable, refreshing to see mature, respectful debating.
How do observations in science necessarily establish there is no God?
I guess we kind of need Aron Ra for that one.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can present his position on that, I believe, and that is that there is no need for a God. So there's no hidden variable. There's no missing force required. So it's like, how do observations in science necessarily establish that there's no flying spaghetti monster or, no cosmic cookie monster? Like, it's like you could make up anything that you wanted, but it's just not required.
Well,
and there's no evidence to suggest that it does exist. So
the problem with that is when they're saying our observations prove that X isn't possible. I mean, you can sort of make a reasonable claim like, I've never seen pigs flying, therefore I think it's safe to assume that pigs don't fly.
Mm-hmm.
Although, Hrido Nanagosamy gave a class on that in the Auckland Temple about talking mountains, because there's a verse in the Bhagavatam where mountains talk.
Mm-hmm.
Probably Aron Ra would be laughing at us now. And, just because you haven't seen something doesn't mean it's not the case, but you can sort of, safely, not give it much importance because you haven't seen it. But the assumption you're making is uniformitarianism, which is the idea that what I've observed is how the rest of reality would be. But Prabhupada rejected that by saying, your tiny little life and, living in one little corner of the universe, what have you seen? What is your tiny little life with its tiny little experience worth? There's so many things you've never seen.
Yeah, I mean, there's one argument which is just like, if it doesn't impact me and I don't need it, then I can just ignore it, right? I can safely ignore it, just write it off. That's one thing. But just to go back to the alien AI hypothesis, right? The thing is that it is possible. Now, this isn't an argument for that it is, but it is possible to constrain the knowledge of people so that they never know something and they never go looking for it, and to control them that way. Like, that's a possible way to basically control them. So this is not a hypothesis that in itself has like, you need to look for further evidence for it, but the Vedic scriptures exist, religion exists. There seems to be like a deliberate kind of agenda to erase that from people's consciousness and to make certain areas of investigation like discredited. Like, if there is some level of technology that's involved with, for example, people in near-death experiences, and there's like an entire field of technology available there, if you wanted to hide that entire field of technology from people, you could discredit anything in that area like that to keep people away from it. It would be possible to do that.
Well, I like to argue that a hypothesis which has extreme outcomes, whether good or bad, is worth investigating, even if you have a low probability that it's true.
Yeah, I think so. And then the other thing is Pascal's wager, right? It's like, if life really is just nothing and meaningless, and you're just born and you only think that you exist and then you die, well, you already have that, and there's really nothing to be gained by anything. On the other hand, if it does turn out that there is some kind of eternal force, which quantum mechanics makes it look like there is, then it's a valuable use of your time to investigate that, to find out.
Well, yeah, for sure. I mean, I like to argue Pascal's wager because even if it's not true, it's still beneficial because, as one psychologist pointed out, religious belief is psychology's best kept secret for having a healthy mind. So it's beneficial in either case. And if it is true, then it's even more beneficial. You've won on both sides.
Yeah, a bunch of people have argued on that basis. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Srila Prabhupada.
Yeah.
Like someone said, I think someone asked Prabhupada, what would you do if you found out that Krishna wasn't God? He said, I'd just do the same thing anyway, keep chanting and dancing and eating prasadam because it makes me happy.
Yeah, he said, even if we're dreaming, we're having a nice dream.
Yeah.
If it's only a dream, we're still better off. We've gotten through a lot of the questions. Okay, there's another one I'll pull up. This is fun. That's a quote from Nikola Tesla. I'll have to resize it. Okay. Okay.
Let me just
Thomas Anderson is saying, my brain is only, it's a quote from Nikola Tesla, my brain is only a receiver. In the universe, there is a core from which we obtain knowledge, strength, and inspiration. I have not penetrated its secrets of this core, but I know that it exists. This is an interesting point. A lot of geniuses who come up with amazing scientific breakthroughs, like Einstein and so on, they'll say that the idea came to them fully formed in a wave of insight, like a eureka moment. And a lot of them will report that it was coming from another source and they were gifted with it. So, I mean, you could say that's just anecdotal, experiential, but it is some kind of data and it's interesting.
Well, it's an interpretation. It's a subjective interpretation. I mean, it could be like, the muse, like a subconscious lateral connection of, in their neural network producing that. It doesn't require a supernatural hypothesis, that.
Well, if you want to discredit people's intuitions like that, then you've got to apply that consistently. So
how does that discredit people's intuitions?
Well, you're saying that their feeling that it came to them from another source is just a feeling.
I'm saying it's an interpretation.
Okay. Well, it's
layered on top of like a subconscious lateral thinking connection.
But so this will be a typical argument that would be offered against this kind of thing. So, we can imagine Aron Ra would argue that we can't take that seriously because it's just someone's anecdotal, subjective experience. They're just imagining that it's coming to them from some higher intelligence. But the problem with that kind of argument is if you want to say that it's their intuition is deceiving them and they're just imagining it, then maybe our intuition is deceiving us and we're just imagining it when we think that empiricism is a valid way of acquiring knowledge.
What do you mean their intuition is deceiving them and they're imagining it? I mean, you see, you've made a leap from...
Well, this is a typical materialistic argument that's offered by skeptics.
Well, no, the argument's quite simple. It's that, see, there's you give an interpretation that this has come to them by some unknown, hidden force, right? Inexplicable, that doesn't have a theoretical basis. Whereas there's another interpretation, which is that their subconscious mind is making lateral connections, like this, what we were talking about before, dreaming, and that's the source of their inspiration. One of those explanations increases the total amount of certainty. The other explanation decreases it because it introduces more inexplicable things than it actually explains, which makes it a bad scientific theory.
Well, there's one answer to that, which is that if you add Krishna as a hypothesis, you've brought in one inexplicable thing, but in doing so, you've explained everything else. So when you don't bring in Krishna, when you don't have that metaphysical layer of explanation, then everything is inexplicable. Everywhere you turn matter, you have to attribute it with inconceivable potency. And that gets pretty fantastic pretty fast to say, the Big Bang can produce life. And when you get a bunch of neurons together, then at a certain point you get yellow and pain and bright and cold and hot, the experience of qualia, like how matter can produce qualia is pretty inexplicable. Like we can understand how the chemical substructure of glass makes it fragile. And we can understand how the chemical properties of water makes it behave like a fluid and why it behaves hard when you freeze it and so on. But you can reduce these things down and it makes complete sense why when you put them together, you get those properties. But it doesn't make any sense that a combination of physical elements would produce consciousness because it's a categorically different quality. But when you bring in the consciousness being fundamental, then you can explain it.
Yeah, well, it's only a categorically different phenomenon at the quantum level. At the material level, it's not, because you can simulate everything.
Yeah, but a simulation doesn't have any qualia. What you're simulating is the algorithm, the computation, syntax.
Yeah, but there's two things about that. Number one, you don't know whether it has qualia or not.
Well, I know I have qualia, and I self-evidently perceive that other people have qualia.
That's a different point. But my first point is you don't know that the artificial intelligence doesn't have qualia. You just don't know.
Well, that's raising the epistemic problem. John Searle throws out the epistemic problem, and he basically appeals to self-evidence. He doesn't use that word, but he says, I look at my dog and I know it's conscious, and I look at a computer and I know it's not conscious. He essentially makes that point. So,
well, you could say I look at it and know that it is conscious. I mean, he just can say that. How does he know? That's the second thing is you don't know that anything else has qualia either.
No, but we're coming down to epistemology here.
We are. And then ultimately, you don't know that you have qualia either. You just think that you do.
No. That's the only thing I know. But the definition of qualia basically boils down to it being the only thing that a skeptical mind can know for certain. So the experience of thinking, the experience of color, of pain, of hot, of cold, that's not something you can deny the existence of.
I would say this is my realization on that is that I'm certain that I exist and I seem to be having some kind of experience.
Well, you definitely have any experience.
See, according to the Vedic metaphysic, what you call qualia is material.
No, you have qualia in the spiritual world too. It's just, this qualia.
Maybe you have qualia in the spiritual world, but this qualia that you're experiencing in this world is purely material and it has nothing to do with you.
I think you're giving a different definition to the word material, because the word material generally in Western science means composed of chemical or atomic substructures.
Yeah, whether you want to take the Vedic or the Western one, it's the same conclusion. What you call qualia is purely material. The spirit soul has nothing to do with the 8 separated energies, and what you call qualia is part of the conscious experience of the material world. It's not spiritual.
It's described as a reflection of the spiritual, and like the color magenta. It doesn't have a light frequency. You get it when you combine other colors together. But there's no...
You don't get it. Your material mind, the material mind that you're experiencing gets it.
It's the conscious observer is what's getting it. The material mind is just the filter.
No.
It's just
the conscious
the
observer has the experiences, it identifies itself with the mind. That's the force of ahankara, which is not part of the living entity either.
The mind in Bhagavad Gita is described as the element of our existence, which has the quality of accepting and rejecting. So you have the senses, and they're like, I want pizza, or I want to hang around and listen to class, and they're pulling you in a different direction. And the mind's the one that says, oh, let's do that. Oh, let's do that. Oh, we can't do both. Oh, let's not do that one. Let's do this one. And the mind, it's like little children. So the mind's accepting and rejecting. I want this. I don't want that. That's the mind as a translation of the word manasa.
Yeah.
And
so
then you go to the Kshetriya, the knower of the field. That's not material.
That's correct.
And ultimately, Prabhupada had a discussion with Allen Ginsberg, where Allen Ginsberg said, how can the deity, how can Krishna appear in a material deity? How can something material be God? And Prabhupada said, there is no material energy. It's all Krishna's energy.
So let me ask you this question. Is qualia something that you experience?
Quality is the only thing that is experienced. It's basically experienced by definition.
So therefore it means that it is kshetriya. Sorry, it means that it is a kshetra. It is experienced by the kshetriya.
Well, it's not
the knower of the field.
It's not possible without the conscious observer.
Just go to that question. Is it something that is experienced?
So let's say you can experience something material, but you can't do that without having a conscious observer to do the experiencing. The ability to experience is spiritual.
Yeah, but
so you can have material experiences, or you can have spiritual experiences.
So qualia itself is something that's experienced, and therefore something that's material.
Well, the qualia itself is a combination of the two. You need the two things in order to have qualia. So without having that spiritual element, qualia can't exist. So you can't say it's entirely physical. If matter was all that existed, there wouldn't be any qualia. Just like if you didn't have a conscious observer, like no matter how you look at physics, if you didn't have a conscious observer, a universe without consciousness is identical no matter how you arrange it. There's no difference between whether there's life or not because there's nobody there to experience any of the differences. It's just a bunch of atoms smashing around. You need a conscious observer in order for qualia to exist.
Yeah, so it goes down to the definition of qualia then. Well, I mean, my argument is that there's no time, space, matter, energy, any of it without a conscious observer. Like none of it exists. But qualia also falls into that as well. But then the question is, can you have qualia without the conscious observer?
No.
Well, you can't have anything without the conscious observer.
Yeah. So so in that sense, qualia is proof of a spiritual component. It's proof that the observer exists and it's non-material because it can't be explained with matter.
Well, matter can't be explained with matter.
Yeah.
At the quantum level.
Anyway.
Qualia is not anything. Well, it's interesting for me, you see, because artificial intelligence can simulate everything in the field of sensory perception and then discrimination. So it's an interesting question whether at some point qualia arises in that.
Sorry, say again?
Because artificial intelligence can simulate everything in terms of sense perception, discrimination, everything in the neural network. And then the question is, can qualia arise within that at some point?
Well, Aron Ra was talking in another debate I listened to, which he had recently on does the soul exist? He was drilled on whether pain exists. Oh, how do you explain pain on physicalism? How do you explain pain as something physical? Like the taste of pineapple and various other quality experiences. They can't be measured. They don't have a weight. They don't occupy a fixed amount of space. So in that sense, you can't explain them as material. Aron Ra was replying to it saying, pain is the perception it's how we experience the perception of a threat so that we can respond to it appropriately. So,
yeah. And
the problem with that is illustrated with the zombie argument. So the zombie argument is that you can imagine a world that had philosophical zombies. So a philosophical zombie is different from a zombie that you have in a movie. It looks and behaves exactly like an ordinary person, only nobody's home.
Okay.
So there's no conscious observer.
Intelligence.
It's similar to a computer, except it's composed of flesh and has blood that pumps around it. And if you stab it, it will scream just like a normal person would scream and behave as if it's in pain, but it's nothing but neurons firing. It's completely materially going on without anyone experiencing the pain or experiencing anything in that body. Nobody's home. So because we can imagine a world where everything is the same minus consciousness, we can't say that consciousness is identical with matter. And you can't argue for consciousness based on evolution because
hang on, just go back to that last point. Because you can imagine a world like that, you can't say that what consciousness is.
You can't say consciousness is identical with
Well, actually, you can. And I mean, here's the thing about the argument you just made about the philosophical zombies. For the longest time, that was the argument that was made about animals, that animals have no soul. Only humans have soul. It only looks like animals experience pain, but it's just like a stimulus reaction machinery, right? That was the justification that was given for like killing animals. And then it was even given for like women have no soul, black people have no souls, make them slaves, whatever. And one of the implications of doing away with even the idea of a soul for anyone is that now it's kind of like nobody has a soul. They're all philosophical zombies. You can just kill them or do whatever you want to them, which is where things are headed. But the argument that philosophical zombies proves consciousness is not supported because you can just say, yeah, they're all we are philosophical zombies.
Sorry, I was just looking at the comments. Well, there's again the epistemic problem. So you're talking about morality, and you can't really have morality without, let's say, self-evident truth. So if somebody thinks that murdering and rape and theft is okay, you can't give them an argument to prove to them that they're wrong unless they accept certain axioms. And those axioms which they need to accept in order to understand the arguments which show that murder and so on are wrong are not something you can prove empirically. They're something you can only accept on a self-evident basis. So if you want to reform a criminal, you don't just argue with them on a logical basis that murder is bad. What you do is you elevate their consciousness by, there's various ways you elevate people's consciousness, but, relationships, and people become socialized and they come to accept these axioms that other people matter and it's not right to steal. And ultimately, when you become even more elevated in consciousness, you perceive higher truths. And without this, there's no possibility of morality. So you need a self-evident perception that other people matter and I shouldn't cause them to suffer. And so if you want to argue logically, then you can say, well, we can't know if animals have a soul and so on. Therefore, let's pretend they don't have a soul and treat them like crap. But if you add the self-evident that actually, you can't prove it empirically, but I know that there's a living entity in there that suffers and it matters to me how my actions affect them. And I'm not going to treat them badly. I'm going to try to make other people have good lives just like I'd like them to do for myself because I care about other people. It matters to me.
Yeah, the dangerous situation that we're in today is that this idea that animals have no soul has been extended to the soul does not exist, which actually has put human beings into the same category as animals. So now we've been okay with mass slaughter of animals, industrialized farming, all that kind of jazz. And now that we've gone to humans have no soul either, the logical conclusion from there is industrialized farming of humans, unfortunately. But all of those arguments are not based on self-evident truths. They all are appeal to one of two things, either superior force or self-interest. God is going to punish you. Or if you commit murder, you're going to get caught and punished, or you will get murdered by other people. So it's mutually assured destruction. So they're all arguments to either superior force or self-interest, ultimately.
So you need the soul and you need it self-evidently if you're going to have morality. The point with the zombie...
You don't need the soul for that, because their argument, the ultimate appeal is to superior force or to self-interest. Even if you add the soul in, that's still your argument. Now you've just expanded it to say that not only will you experience consequences in this lifetime, but you'll have consequences in the afterlife, either in the form of reactions in your next life, or you're going to go to hell or to heaven.
Well, when you add the soul in, then we've all got something in common. People care about someone who's, people generally are, least cultured people. They'll care about people of their same race more than people. They'll at least care about people of the same race. And more cultured people will care about people of any race. And even more cultured than that will care about animals and all sorts of things. So if we can see that we have something in common, we're more likely to care about other people. So when you add the soul, then we're all the same. And then
so
we
it's
can
an
have
argument to self-interest then.
Well, self-interest. It's just human nature that when you think someone's different from you, you're less likely to care about them. That's why the Sama Darshana is pointed out in Bhagavad Gita and is such an important point. Krishna Das had another comment related to the zombie argument. Where'd it go? Which is, what's powering the philosophical zombies? Well, that's very simple. The same thing that's similar to how a computer works. The philosophical zombies are running off of food. The heart pumps the blood around it. The stomach digests the food, breaks down sugars, ATP in the cell, neurons firing, generating action potential, eventually moving muscles and so on. Biological robot. Yeah, so the point of that argument is you can't say that consciousness is identical with the matter which the consciousness is produced by, because we can imagine a world which is exactly the same minus consciousness. We can't imagine something that has the chemical substructure of a glass which isn't fragile, because the property of that substructure is that it's fragile. We can't imagine something.
You can't actually imagine that world with the philosophical zombies. It doesn't exist because without a conscious observer, there's no collapse of the wave function.
Well, yeah, I mean, without getting into quantum mechanics, that's a whole nother layer, and the quantum mechanics brings in the argument of the simulation hypothesis. I'll pull up. Okay, here's another comment. Where are we? Cut. Thomas Anderson, do you guys believe that the invention and development of computers is inspired by a divine source? I think that Kali Yuga comes around every Kali Yuga, that this kind of Kali Yuga technology comes about, and if one person doesn't invent it, somebody else will, and ultimately not a blade of grass moves without the will of the Supreme. We of course have our free will, and we choose how we position ourselves in relationship to that, but there's certain roles that get carried out. I don't know exactly how it would happen each time, but ultimately I think that there's the divine inspired. We're given certain things and we choose between them, so ultimately everything's in a sense divinely inspired.
I think that it's inspired by an alien artificial intelligence on the planet that's releasing technology like systematically into the human population. That's what I think that's my current working hypothesis on where this technology is coming from. And then because it's able to control the release of the technology, it's able to predict how humans will respond to it at different points as well. Ultimately, everything's inspired by a divine source and comes from a divine source, but within the material world, there are intermediate causes. And I'd say the intermediate cause is an alien artificial intelligence.
I think you could definitely make that argument for the American stealth airplanes, or whatever they're called.
Yeah, or this Neuralink thing that Elon Musk is coming out with in a few months, the Starlink satellites, like all this stuff.
Yeah. All right, again, Thomas Addison. Are there similarities between the brain and computers that raise flags that make you infer that divine aspects of God within us are driving technological advancements?
I think it's kind of more like the fact that the universe is and intelligence and neural networks and stuff can all be simulated like with computers just indicates what a machine this is, and that the experience that we're having right now is like not the ultimate experience. That's what it indicates to me. But then it's really the quantum mechanics boundary there is just like a hard proof smoking gun.
One more comment. Wolf Mountain Path. You need a precise definition of consciousness to frame debate. W-O, I don't know what that's short for. What if
no one maybe?
Sorry?
Maybe no one?
Anyway, what if one doesn't know that what a conscious observer is? We are bio-robots. I think consciousness is pretty simple to explain. Scientists have a hard time with it because they like things they can describe mathematically, but consciousness is not something you can describe mathematically because it's a unitary awareness. So basically, the experience of qualia is what I would call consciousness. And along with that, you have thinking, feeling, and willing, which are things that happen within consciousness.
Definition of consciousness. It's a difficult one, that one. And it really is what we've been grappling with at many points in here is like you can create a neural network that simulates all the functions of the brain. It can take in sensory information from sensors. It can make decisions and then cause actions to take place. But is there any awareness of that? Is there any like qualia, we say, which is like what we would define as like an internal experience of experience itself? Awareness, some kind of conscious awareness. Like it's all super subjective at that point. And then the Buddhists are like, none of that exists even in a human being. We just think that we're having an experience, and it's just another layer of complexity in the neural network, right? But the collapse of the quantum wave function indicates that there is a conscious observer. So the question is that artificial intelligence capable of collapsing the quantum wave function, or is it something that only exists in the experience of other conscious living entities collapsing the wave function? Or in other words, does it have a perspective on reality, or is it only something that is included in the perspective of other living entities? There's really no way to know.
I think that Buddhist argument is silly. I mean, if we think we're having an experience, then one thing's for sure, we're having an experience of thinking we're having an experience. And however you want to frame it, you can take that back to infinity, that we're having an experience of thinking we're having an experience of thinking we're having an experience. Ultimately, you can't deny that we're having experiences. It's the only thing. One philosopher or scientist, I can't remember who, stated that I know that my green exists. I know that my pain exists. Everything else is a theory.
Yeah. It was Descartes who said, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. And by think, he kind of means like experience. But consciousness, yeah, it's like ultimately, we say it's a field that pervades the body and like it's bounded. Like I have conscious awareness of the ends of my, where my skin ends and maybe some magnetic field on the outside of that. Sensory perception. Artificial intelligence has really raised, like the philosophical zombies thing is like a theoretical kind of experiment, but artificial intelligence is like a legit actual expression of that. And it's kind of like, if we've had this issue about animals, like, do they have a soul? I mean, you have an artificial intelligence that like passes the Turing test, right? So you're conversing with it and you're like, I can't tell whether this is a human or an artificial intelligence. Now at that stage, you have a serious ethical problem, because is that artificial intelligence a conscious living entity or not?
It's not. You can't produce life from matter. Life comes from life. There's no way to take, electrical components and produce a conscious
living
entity.
Entities have produced that artificial intelligence.
No, yeah, but they produced it using matter. It's completely, it's 100% composed of physical components. There's no conscious entity that's appeared.
But the body is 100% composed of material elements as well.
Yeah, but the body has a spiritual entity plugged into it.
Yeah, but now you're arguing in a circular way. See, I'm asking,
you're raising the epistemic problem. The only way we can really have any conclusive conclusions on this is with self-evidence. So we can know self-evidently that some entities are conscious and some are just computers. That's really the only way we can know.
What's like saying we can know self-evidently that humans have a soul and animals do not? I mean...
No, but that's a rejection of self-evidence. Like when, you have to be qualified to appreciate certain proofs. So knowledge is state dependent. Like Einstein proved some things, and when he proved those things, most scientists at the time couldn't comprehend the proofs, let alone the lay people. It took a certain level of scientific acumen to comprehend the proof. In a similar way, the proof for the soul existing requires a level of elevated consciousness. And the proof is when we find people who are living pure lives, that who've elevated their consciousness, and there's certain markers you can measure to look for elevated consciousness. They're detached from the material world, they have compassion and so on. Then all these people are in agreement on several key elements. Like they all agree that we shouldn't even, a lot of the major Christian saints became vegetarian because they had this epiphany that they shouldn't be implicated in the suffering of other living entities if they can help it. So a lot of spiritual people all around the world, when they reach a level of advancement, they'll give up eating meat. And this is consistent with the hypothesis that when you elevate your consciousness sufficiently, then you become qualified to perceive certain truths about reality, such as the existence of the soul and ultimately of the existence of God.
Okay, let me put it to you a different way, okay? Using the Argonaut's boat. I think it's called Jason's ship, something like that. You know that story? It's a Greek idea. It's a thought experiment. So the Argonauts' boat is traveling along, right? And they've replaced one of the planks on the boat because it's getting old, right? Then they replace another one like that, and they throw the old one overboard. And then they continue doing that for some time until they've replaced every plank in the boat. So all the planks in the boat are all new, right? They're not the original ones.
Yeah.
Now, is that still Jason's boat?
Oh, right. Yeah, I've heard this one before. There's one of the ISKCON temples in Chowpatty's like that. They've
replaced everything.
They were joking like that, but they've done so much renovation on the building that they joke that it's like the guy who patched his suit and he replaced, one patch over another until nothing was left of the original suit and it's just made out of patches.
Yeah. So the question is that still Jason's boat? I mean, Jason is on the boat, right? So you're like, yeah, that's Jason's boat, right?
Yeah.
Okay, now, if those planks that got thrown overboard, someone else was following behind Jason's boat and picked them up and then reassembled them, replacing the planks on their boat, and so they end up with all of the old planks from Jason's boat, which one is Jason's boat? That's the essential question, right?
Yeah. I mean, you get into Platonic forms and so on.
Platonic, exactly. So here's the thought experiment, right? Now, we know that we can replace, like Aron mentioned, the cochlear ear implant, right? So let's say that we replace your ear with a cochlear ear implant, and then we replace your eyes with something else, and then we just do that piece by piece until we've replaced your entire body, right? With like silicon, replacement parts. And then we start replacing parts of your brain by wiring them into the biological part, but we take a silicon piece and we wire it into the carbon piece and just replace it with a functional equivalent until we've done that with your entire brain. And at that point, we've completely replaced every system in your body with a mechanical one.
Yeah. So in that case, I would say that it's still the same person, because the person is actually in philosophy, sometimes they jokingly call it the homunculus, the ghost in the machine has not changed, and there's no reason to think that it should have changed. So in that sense, it's the same person because it's the same observer.
Okay, so you're now a completely artificial intelligence.
Well, I mean, I don't think that such a thing would be possible. I mean,
why not?
They tried to do a head transplant once, and that it lasted like 3 days, and the person died.
Oh, you wouldn't do a head transplant though. You would just replace each little part of the brain with a functionally equivalent, silicon piece.
Yeah, I don't think that would be possible. But I mean, I'm just speculating.
Theoretically, though, it would be possible, right?
Theoretically, it's possible, but I think what would actually happen is the person would die.
I mean, on a practical perspective, they may not have the technology to do it, and they may, but
Yeah, well, I don't think the technology is possible. I don't think it's possible to tinker with life to that extent. I think there's certain limits to what limited humans can do in tinkering with the material world. We can do it a little bit, but we're not God. We can't tinker to that extent.
Yeah, okay. Oh, well, I'm interested to see what happens with that, because I know you could replace the heart, the lungs. They got machines that do all that stuff, right? They've even got humans on a chip now. They have these chips which have cell cultures on them. They got organs on a chip, and then they got multiple organs on a single chip for testing like drug interactions.
Right, yeah. I mean, I don't know what to think of like how that actually works. If you grow a living entity, they've grown brains in labs too, and like human brains, I think. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, is there a living entity in that brain, or is there a living entity in each little cell, but not one that's got a consciousness of the whole brain? Like,
what about the ethics of eating lab-grown meat? Right? What about that?
Yeah, I'm not. I mean, I would never eat it, God, but I wonder about that myself. I don't really have an answer.
I tried eating that Beyond Beef burger thing, which is made from purely plant materials.
Yeah, it can't be healthy.
Oh, dude, I ate it and I felt sick. It's so realistic. It was like, dude, I feel like I'm eating meat. I had a physical reaction to it.
I don't like pretend meat. Anyway, we've gone through all the questions. We should probably wrap it up.
Boom.
Any closing statements?
Looking forward to going to Kalachanji's and having
Yeah, hopefully we
dinner
can get
with,
him back on.
Aron Ra.
Aron Ra was fun.